All right, welcome to the first show of Progress Unlocked. I'm very happy to say that my first guest is with me now. He is Dr. Matt Clancy. Okay, Matt, would you like to say a few things about yourself before we start?
Sure. Thanks for having me on as your inaugural guest. Very much an honor. Um, I am a research fellow at Open Philanthropy, where I work on science policy questions and the grant and run the science policy sort of grant program. I should say that's the meta science program. So it's about sort of how do we make scientific institutions work more effectively, not me deciding which kinds of science projects are worth funding or anything like that. I'm probably best known because I created and write this living literature review called New Things Under the Sun, which is about social science research about innovation.
Okay, awesome. So, I guess I guess one of the things to first address is why should we matter about technological progress? Because I think while it's pretty much accepted in the progress movement that it's pretty important, I think it's fair to say that if you asked people outside of it, it's not so clear cut whether people actually think it's something desirable.
Yeah, so it's kind of a big question. I think that historically, like over the very long run, you talk like hundreds of years or even thousands of years, the sort of the long run there's been a long run improvement in sort of the material prosperity that most people live in, especially in the developed world, but not only in the developed rich world. Um, and a classic result in economics tried to sort of apportion out how much of the increase in differences in income and so on around the world can be attributed to sort of investment versus the size of the population versus this or that. And they found that it's basically the lion's share, the vast majority of it is due to changes in differences in technology, or it can't be accounted for by this other sort of stuff. So technology is kind of the big thing that matters for different material standards and material living standards over the long run. And you know, uh, without it, like living in times of extreme scarcity is not really conducive to sort of human flourishing. I don't. I'm not such a person to think that like it's impossible to be happy without advanced technology. Obviously, people lived millennia without it, um, but I think more people flourish and have happy and lives that they are in more control of and sort of feel better about in environments where there is a higher standard of technological progress than less. Um, at a more even sort of abstract level, which I'm not sure if you're asking about, you could ask like, what does technology do? It increases our capabilities, our ability, it expands the options of things we can do. In some sense, that's neutral, right? Like, because there are good options and bad options, and so increasing our option set. You could imagine technological progress would mostly be used, for example, to oppress other people or to sort of uh, do bad things. But historically, that hasn't really been the case, and I think there's a bunch of good reasons to for why that's the case. One example is that it's not easy to invent new things. So if you do, you want to have a return on your invention. So you either need to benefit personally or you're going to sell it to other people. If you're going to try to benefit personally, then you're going to invent stuff that makes your life better. Maybe it helps you oppress other people, uh, but that's only one way to do it. But if you're going to, most people, like most inventions are invented to sell to a large market because the cost of inventing is high and the sort of the value that one person gets isn't high enough to justify all the effort. And so if you're going to sell something to a lot of people, then it has to be something that makes a lot of people's lives better for them to want to buy it. And so there's just this sort of natural bias in technology, even though it just sort of expands our capabilities, it's sort of a neutral force. But the fact that we choose what to invent means that we tend to invent stuff that makes that people want and makes their lives better. Sometimes people make mistakes. They don't know what they really want. They want, maybe they think they want Facebook and then they change their mind after they try it for a while. Sometimes stuff has side effects that are bad, like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. People don't go out trying to invent stuff that's worse for the world, but it does sometimes happen. But I think like on net, it's been historically like a tremendous force for good rather than bad.
And where would you say that the state of technological progress is at the moment? And I appreciate that any economy you look at, you're going to have various industries that are going to undergo different levels of growth. But where would you say the general state is at the moment, and perhaps focusing on a particular industry as an example?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been until the last maybe 2 to 3 years, there had been a sense that technological progress was something had gone wrong with it, and it was disappointing us. I have always thought that that story was a little bit more complicated just than we're not inventing as well as we used to. I think what is really happening is it got harder to invent stuff. So I just read this book, Chip Wars by Chris Miller, about semiconductors. And, you know, he had some quote in there that to design a new modern semiconductor chip is like $100 million endeavor just to design the chip, much less build it and fabricate it. And that's like, that just boggles my mind to spend hundreds of $1 billion simply to sort of draw the CAD diagram of how this chip is going to look, which is probably a gross oversimplification of what they're doing. But that's a sense in which, the early advances, like, we could just wire it out on pen and paper, and then things get harder over time. And I think that's sort of a natural state. There's just another real natural reason that's the case, which is like, yeah, you're going to do the easy stuff first. And then stuff that you haven't done yet, you didn't do because it was harder or because you didn't know how to do it. And the stuff that you didn't know how to do, you're going to have to wait till you learn how to do new stuff. New knowledge tends to like, sometimes it displaces old knowledge. So, instead of needing to know or instead of needing to know Newtonian physics, maybe now you can get away with quantum physics or relativistic physics. But like most of the time, when we learn new stuff, it kind of adds to what you have to know. I was a physics major. I still took Newtonian physics, and then if I want to go further, I have to study these additional things. It's not like I can jump straight to the frontier. So anyway, that's the first thing. Is like it's not necessarily that we're not inventing at the same pace. It's just that inventing got harder, and we worked harder. So the amount of resources that get put into, for example, developing semiconductors is huge compared to what it was in the 1950s. And that's how Moore's law, the doubling of the number of transistors you can fit on a chip, kept pace, even though it kept getting harder and harder to do. We just worked harder. So I think there was like a statistical case that, oh, look, innovation, something's gone wrong with innovation. Well, it wasn't really going wrong. It was just like things always get harder. And you could see that in the data that it was getting harder. On the other side, there was kind of these subjective arguments that technological progress was sort of disappointing us. Like if you look at 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was made, decades before 2001, it was kind of like a forecast of where they thought we'd be in 2001, and we didn't hit that target at all. And so I think that like I always thought that there were two things there. One is just like the direction that technology went was not, we extrapolated from the space race and think, well, we're just going to have faster and better rockets and it's just going to go. But it actually, we went in a different direction. We went in like this computerized internet networked world, which wasn't foreseen in the 60s. And I don't know which is more technological advance, but it didn't look like what we thought. And so people used to say like, if you take away all the screens, has there even been any technological progress? And I was like, well, yeah, because the screens are the thing. We spend, like, look at your iPhone, tells you, like, you spent 4 hours per day on this device.
It's
Like,
got to mean something.
that's a large chunk of your life. So anyway, and then I think there's also this natural tendency for people to, like, think that things were better when they were younger, right? Like, so there was better technological progress when I was younger, and now it's disappointing. So anyway, that was the story like a couple of years ago. But then with the coronavirus and the COVID, and like the mRNA vaccines, and then layering on top of that the new large language models and like advances in AI, I'm not sure people really have that sense anymore that like technological progress is slow and disappointing. I think if anything, the pendulum has swung and people think it's going too fast now, and there's letters saying we should pause progress in these things. So yeah, it's been like the answer to that question has changed a lot in like the last just few
Yeah, my
years.
reason for asking was because I noticed that Tyler Cowen. I don't know if he was the first guy to start talking about it, but his book that I think came out, I think it was over a decade ago now, The Great Stagnation, he did seem to talk about this alleged, well, stagnation of growth. But like you say, it does seem to have
Hmm.
given way to these calls for putting moratoriums on progress instead.
Yeah, even Cohen, I think that book's subtitle was like, it'll get better eventually, like the stagnation won't last forever. And I think he's now sort of like on the, all right, we're done with that now. things have things have pivoted.
I think another pretty major trend at the moment is, I think, the tendency for many Western countries, especially, to approach population collapse. And I was wondering, what effects does population have on innovation? Are more populous countries more innovative, or is it not quite as straightforward a relationship as if one goes up, so does the other?
Yeah, so it's kind of that's another sort of confusing and sort of subtle point. Like there's a sort of general belief in a lot of contemporary economic theories of growth that at the end of the day, the sort of bottleneck to innovation is human brains. And so, the number of human brains does, like, if you have more people working on innovation, you're going to have more innovation. So that would suggest more populous countries should have more technological progress. But the challenge is that the reason that that's not really true is because technological progress doesn't happen in a vacuum, but we all share ideas with each other. And so if I'm in Ireland, like a small country of, a couple million people, I'm learning everything that they do in the United States. I can read the papers. I can sort of keep up with the updates, and so I can, in some sense, it's not like we're two different little groups doing our own innovations. It's like we're part of one giant interconnected global innovation system. And so, in that sense, like the global economy or like the global population is probably more important um, than the population of any given country. It's not necessary. It's really though the sort of the global population of innovators. If you're too poor to be able to contribute to frontier research, then that doesn't you know it's hard for you to contribute then, right? So like it's a little bit complicated, but in general, you know, there's like kind of an assumption in economics that population matters. It's kind of always implicitly assumed to be like the size of the population of innovators in the world. Um, so that includes some assumptions about how economically developed the places are that the people are coming from. And there's a little bit of evidence sort of consistent with this idea, but most of it comes from a long time ago, like the pre industrial world. So, there's a famous paper by Michael Kramer about this feedback loop between population and economic growth. And he sort of talks about like, you imagine like most animal species, they exhibit this population dynamic where they grow exponentially, but then they hit the limits of their food supply, and then they kind of stabilize or they crash or they maybe go zigzagging around. But humans are different because we also sort of eat technology. We eat stuff we invent, and the more people there are, the more potential minds there are to invent new things. And so that predicts that instead of this exponential that collapses, you could actually have this like super exponential. So the more people you have, the faster you grow. And he tries to present evidence that actually this describes human history up to sort of the industrial revolution really well. Like the more people there were, the faster the growth rate of the population. And I think the best piece of evidence he's got is he looks at a couple different continents that were isolated from each other. So like the Eurasian slash Africa landmass is sort of one group. The Americas is another group, and then you've got Australia, you've got Tasmania, and these groups didn't these countries were sort of isolated before like the age of sailing and colonialism and stuff. And all else equal, you would expect like they'd have roughly the same number of people per acre uh, whenever they first met each other. But actually, like the bigger land area had more people per acre than like the small ones. It's actually like sort of counterintuitive. You might think like, oh well, like Australia is gonna, it's got less land. If people grow exponentially, maybe they'll be more crowded. But actually, like the most crowded place was the biggest place, like Europe, Asia, Africa. And he sort of argues it's because they started with the most people, so they had the most ideas, they shared them, that was able to support a bigger population, and they grew at a faster rate than the Americas or Australia or Tasmania. But I'm always like, you can't extrapolate too far from that because that was a long time ago, and the way we do innovation is very different than how we did it before the Industrial Revolution. And that story even doesn't really work today, where like more people doesn't lead to more economic growth, which leads to more people. If anything, like economic prosperity seems to lead to like less people, or like a slowing population rate. So there's something more complicated to the story about people's preferences and so on. That's not in that very simple model. But I think the basic idea that historically, more people working on innovation is good for the speed of innovation is probably still true.
So, just to touch on what you said before, um, it's no surprise that innovation, the way it's done today at least, differs considerably from when it was done in the Industrial Revolution. But what would you say are the primary differences between the innovative practices between today and back then?
So I think one of the biggest differences is the role of science in innovation today. So for most of human history, um, I think a lot of innovation was sort of tinkering based. Like you try something new, if it works better, you sort of keep doing that. Other people copy you, that becomes the new standard. It's kind of an evolutionary process. And then people tinker from that base. Um, Evolution is this purely random phenomenon, like to a first approximation, where you're just trying random things and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. Like, there's a random mutation in the DNA. I don't know if tinkering was ever quite like that. Like people weren't just randomly stuff. They had some idea of why they were going to try and build this canoe this way instead of that way. So they had some kind of, in the background, causal model of how the world works to guide their thoughts. But the role of these sort of causal models to help us decide what to try and what not to try is just like, I think, way more sophisticated and necessary than it was before. So in uh, in technological domains that are kind of mature, where we've been working on them for a while, it's harder to stumble upon something that everyone's missed. But using sort of science as like a map of what might work and what might not work, you can kind of you can try things and learn to do things that would have been very hard to just sort of stumble upon. So I think that that's uh, one of the biggest differences between modern innovation and innovation a long time ago. But there's a lot of other uh, there's a lot of other similar kinds of like changes in sort of the magnitude. Like I think it's much, like I said earlier, it's much harder. I think to push the frontier for certain things, you have to know a lot more knowledge. You have to work with a bigger team. You need more complicated tools, more resources. That makes it harder for kind of individual amateurs to push the frontier because it just takes so much technological support or team support or scientific knowledge to push the frontier. And so I think that's why you see more innovation happening in kind of organizations and so on than kind of like gentlemen scientists or gentlemen inventors like in the past.
So, I guess a recent thing that we've seen, which is something that we mentioned earlier, is AI and the fact that it's been improving at such a rapid rate. Do you think that that's going to have a major impact on the way innovation is implemented in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like I think it's going to be really big. I think it's going to be a very big deal. I wouldn't be surprised if we actually do see a long run increase in the rate of growth. Now, I say that, but I think that there are there are people who think is who would agree with that, but they would sort of push it much further than me. Like they would say we're going to enter a singularity, or we're going to enter um, some kind of rate of growth that is just going to be like nothing else we've ever experienced before. So I'm more skeptical of that. But I think that the kinds of things that I could see AI transforming is, for one, right now we have this problem called the burden of knowledge, a phrase coined by the economist Ben Jones, which I think is I'm a big fan of this idea, and I've alluded to it several times already. Just that you have to know more stuff to push the frontier, and one way we've traditionally dealt with that problem is we've built, instead of having one person have to learn a billion different specialties so that they can be the one who designs, say, a new Boeing aircraft. You just have a giant team of specialists who all work on their individual little domain. Somebody's working on some part of the engine, somebody else is designing or modeling the air, how it's going to flow over it, and all this other stuff. Somebody's working on the composite materials. So you have a team of specialists. And that works well as long as problems are decomposable into lots of subproblems. But there might be other problems that are hard to do that. There's just a lot of interactions. And we actually have some papers that find like uh, big teams have a harder time doing disruptive science. That is disruptive has this technical meaning in science where when people cite your paper, they don't cite the papers that you cited. It kind of is this idea that um, you created you made the old ideas obsolete, and so nobody cites them anymore. They just cite you. And bigger teams are less likely to produce papers that have this character than sort of small teams. And I think one reason is because small teams maybe have an easier time making these weird connections and seeing these kind of complicated interactions. Whereas a large team of specialists, maybe you decompose it into a lot of problems, but you don't see these interactions. But an AI that's able to sort of hold all of human knowledge in its head might be able to spot these kind of connections, and so maybe it will be able to make, maybe it will begin to reverse some of that, and maybe be able to make some interesting and creative uh, ideas. And then on top of that, another issue is we're kind of limited in our the way we use science is the theories that we develop. They have to be simple enough for humans to kind of hold them in their head and understand. Economics is most famous in this, where we take all of the complexity of a modern global economy, and we're it's two lines on a chart, supply and demand, and that explains things. And we make these simplifying assumptions that kind of get you to close to the right answer, and we know that there's a lot of extra fiddly details, and we hope that they kind of wash out. Um, an AI maybe is not going to be limited by some of those things. Neural nets are able to make really complicated, they're able to take really complicated data and form really complicated internal models that seem to outperform a lot of our sort of theoretical models that we've developed in the past. So maybe this sort of predictive ability will also be really useful for science. And then the third thing is kind of going back to what you said earlier about just having lots of minds is good. If you develop a point where they're a good substitute for a lot of the tasks we do, well then, that's having more minds on that problem. The ones everybody else can sort of focus on the subset of things that humans are really good at, that AIs are not really good at yet. And so for all those kind of reasons, I'm optimistic, but also I'm still I'm not quite on board the train of we're going to be having we're going to go to GDP 1 million in 2 years or 3 years once we develop AGI.
So you're clearly more optimistic than pessimistic when it comes to the growth rates that you anticipate will happen because of AI. Do you think there are any reasons to be wary of AI? Because I was quite surprised by some of the people who signed. I can't remember what the letter's called, but it's a letter that came out recently, and many signatories, I think, including people like Elon Musk, who I thought would be, very enthusiastic about AI, but he seems to be quite cautious about it, to say the least. Where do you stand on it?
Yeah. Um, so I think I recognize the concerns as legitimate and valid. I should say, I think the you know, my take on them is sort of it is true that it's a new kind of technology, it's a new kind of intelligence of a sort, and it could be used for I think the main thing people are worried about is that right, it's going to have its own goals that are contrary to human goals. A thing I've been actually thinking a lot about at Open Phil and trying to figure out what if anything we should do about it is more like we already know there are people who are unaligned. Like there are people with goals that are not shared by the rest of humanity. You know, like terrorists or criminals or whatever. And one thing that has been, I think, helpful for us as a species is that cutting edge science is expensive, and it tends to require like a large team, like these forces I was saying earlier, lots of specialized knowledge to do sort of frontier science stuff. And if really cheap, really good AIs remove that barrier, so that an individual can collaborate with a machine to basically do cutting edge science, um, well, then suddenly you have to worry about people beginning to use that cutting edge science for bad purposes, like in particular, like bioweapons and stuff like that. I think that's like a real concern. Um, I think that I don't see how we can sort of stop the technology from coming. There's too many different people working on it, um, and so I don't see how we can like globally coordinate a sort of cessation of it. And um, I also think it could be really beneficial, and so like we probably want it to happen. I think we need to learn about we probably have to develop new safety standards and try to think of ways to make sure that they uh, that these intelligences are used uh, for purposes that are not like super bad. But it's probably very hard to develop that kind of stuff sort of in abstract. Like I never really had much faith that you'd just be able to like reason out in advance how you will control a technology that hasn't yet been developed. And so I think like we kind of have to go forward. Um, if like maybe if we could slow it down, maybe if that was feasible, that would be desirable. But I think like I don't really know how we would do that. Like the pause letter, I could see the case for a pause being useful to like develop the social coordination ability to pause things. There was a lot of pushback about like would the pause really help? Would people just push the science forward without while staying within the letters of the law of the pause? So that's all complicated. Um, Long story short, like I think that I agree with the people that say like we should put in a lot of research and effort into sort of making sure these things are trustworthy. But I think areas where I'm more optimistic than sort of doom people is one, I'm not optimistic about like a self-recursive loop where an AI becomes like smart enough to improve itself and then becomes smart enough to improve itself and then like it gets to be like incomprehensible to us. It's like ants talking to a human. I think that like we live in a world with large organizations that are already basically like super intelligences. They have huge parallel processing capabilities of like individual humans who can work on figuring and gaming things out. They can pull together huge sums of knowledge that is more than any one person could do. They can get together and create complicated plans. And so I think we already kind of know what that world looks like, and these super intelligences have not been able to figure out ways to like improve their internal systems to like make themselves ever smarter and smarter. So I'm like a bit pessimistic about like this recursive loop. And another reason why I think I'm a bit more optimistic than some people is I think that like there are private incentives that are pretty strong to make the technologies trustworthy and like aligned because uh, if it's not and you put it in charge of anything important and it blows up in your face, then like who wants to use that technology? And if people don't want to use it for important stuff, then that's sort of leaving a lot of value on the table. I think people who are worried would sort of retort that there are reasons that they have counter arguments too to those kind of things. So I don't think there's like a knockdown definitive argument or anything, but Rather than go into all that, I think I can leave it there unless you want to talk more about it. But yeah,
Well,
I'll
I
leave
was
it
just
there.
going to say, I think people who tend to be against the letter that's been signed, I've heard some of them refer to the likes of Elon Musk now as Luddites. And I was wondering,
Mhm.
do you think that's a fair label to throw at them? Because that's another claim that I keep hearing about AI: the idea that it's going to, destroy many jobs. Although there doesn't seem to be much talk from their side about the number of jobs it could create.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like it's a good question. Like, what differentiates the like Ludditism from wanting to pause AI? I think if there is a distinction, it's because like Luddites, the conventional wisdom is that they're more about like we don't want to automate away our jobs, and so it's sort of a job protection motivation, and that might be in the AI pause community as sort of one strain. But I think I think the more dominant strain is that this is a technology expands our capabilities, it lets us do new things. Um, I think a lot of people in the AI community are worried that this is going to greatly expand our capabilities, and the entity in charge of how those capabilities will be used is a foreign intelligence, like some kind of neural net that we don't understand and might have goals that we didn't think through all the ways it could go. Like I said, I'm maybe that's the case, but I'm actually like also just worried about individual bad actors, getting a lot of capabilities. And as I said earlier, like you can use these technologies to oppress people. Um, and so an individual may want to just, use these things for bad. I think that we will probably eventually figure out solutions for how to, stop that kind of stuff. But it could be messy getting there, especially since things are moving fast and we have a lot of social processes that were sort of and deliberation mechanisms that were built up over 100 years where technological progress moved at a couple percent a year rather than like leaping forward.
Okay, so when it comes to scientific research, you've written extensively about that and about how different things will have a factor on it. Uh, to what extent does the who behind the researcher have an effect on what is being researched?
Yeah. So I like to. I'm an economist by training, and so like I like to think about this as like a contrast to sort of a market. Like, how do you decide? How does like a entrepreneur decide what business to start or what product to sell or what to invent? And an economist would say like, well, they look at the market, right? Where's the most profitable opportunity? So the market is sending us signals about what people want. We have information about what it costs to produce stuff. If we can figure out how to produce the thing that people most want for the least money, we make the most profit. And that's like actually kind of an efficient way for a market to guide individual actors. Science, though, is kind of got a similar problem where there are different sorts of knowledge that would be more or less useful to sort of society. Um, there's different levels of difficulty getting that knowledge, right? Like we could build a large hadron collider, or we could fund like a lot of different, little uh, like little biology experiments. And so, how do you? But we don't have a market for science where people pay for the discoveries that they most value, and then scientists try to figure out how to maximize profit. And I think, to be clear, even though I'm an economist, I think that that would not be a good system. That would be a bad system to run science because science has got this property of like it spills over, it's non-rival. Once somebody discovers it, everyone can use it. So you would get all these inefficiencies if you try to get people to pay for it. What are you going to keep it secret? No, we're not going to do that. But it does mean that we have this problem of we don't have the same signals to direct people what to work on that sort of is valued by a lot of people in society. And instead, what we have is we have a scientific community that has these sort of social norms about like, there's these sort of professional incentives, right? Like if you publish in the top journals or you get grants, then you can get tenure and then you can advance in your career. But all of that stuff, like that advance, basically requires you got to convince your community of peers that your work is important, that your knowledge contribution deserves to be in this journal or deserves to get this funding. And so it's basically like you're trying to convince other people who are working in the same field that this is important. And at the same time, you have a bit of freedom to work on yourself. You're motivated by these professional incentives, but you also may have individual curiosity. Most scientists probably go into this like out of pure personal curiosity reasons. Like Ben, aren't you like a physics background person? And did
Yeah,
you go into that because you were interested in physics or for market reasons?
yeah, I'd say that's the reason why I enrolled in it in the first place. Yeah, it wasn't for much other reasons.
Right. So anyway, the upshot is like individual motivation. Basically, the interests of people in the community matter a lot. Whether it's your individual interest, what you think is important, or your peers deciding what is interesting and should be published and should be going in these top journals. And so the identity of the people in that community can start to matter. And like what their life experiences were like can affect what they sort of think are important questions. And the best kind of evidence I think that we have on this is about gender, and gender works really well because I think it like the reason the best evidence is best on this is because like it's an important question, but also like the data is is easier to get. Like you can infer somebody's gender very easy compared to like inferring other parts of their life, previous life experience, right? Um, but there's a lot of studies that show like individual women scientists will sort of work on research topics that are different than their male peers. Like they'll work on, like in medicine, diseases they're more likely to work on diseases that affect women. Or when they do a study of a particular drug, they're more likely to do an additional analysis about how does the drug work differently in different genders. Okay, whereas men maybe will forget that step or ignore it or so on. Even in like history, there are differences in what men and women chose to work on as like their thesis topics and stuff. Um, and I think that that speaks to sort of a differences in background. But I think the other interesting thing is once these fields, uh, there's been this long trend over like the 20th century of women becoming uh, more integrated into fields where they were like previously excluded. Um, and as that process happened, these differences start to fade away. So like there when in the 70s when women inventors were much rarer than they are today, they're still pretty rare, but like or still uncommon, but it was much worse even then. Women were like much more likely to work on uh, like inventions that targeted diseases faced by women than men. As women became more represented in the class of inventors, that divergence has begun to narrow. Similarly, in history, as women accounted for a greater share of historians, there's not as much difference anymore in the topics people work on. And so I think what happens there is, people have their own individual life experience. That is one thing that informs what they think is important to work on. If I'm a woman, maybe I have, I'm just more aware of these diseases. Ben, can you hear this uh, kid on my monitor? I'm going to go turn off my monitor.
Just a
I've
little bit,
got
yeah.
kids at home and they're being watched by grandma. But anyway, you'll have to edit that out, or you can leave it in for charming color commentary. Anyway, um, parents maybe are working on stuff that affects kids more than non-parents. Anyway,
Yeah.
so women tended to work on these diseases that are more likely to face women, but as like women become like better represented in biomedical sciences, those career incentive sides things start to happen. Like you're like, oh, I better include one of those analyses about what happens if you do this drug in different genders because I might get peer reviewed by these people who care about that kind of thing, And so like suddenly that starts to affect things. And there's like a really neat little study about what happened to the research of faculty at universities in the United States when their universities went co-ed, and so started having women students, and they could compare them to groups that were single gender, and you can see this effect where like even these sort of incumbent male professors start to change what they work on once their school goes co-ed, which includes like more female students, but also more female faculty and so on. And so I think it kind of matters because like since we don't have this market mechanism, and even the market is not perfect, like it doesn't like perfectly get people to work on what are the most socially important topics, but in science we don't necessarily have that. So I think that's like an argument for why it's good to have like representation in science. You want the scientific community to sort of reflect the priorities of society at large, because you want them to be working on things that are going to be useful to society at large, and you kind of have to count on their taste about what counts uh, to drive that decision rather than some kind of market feedback mechanism.
So I think it's fair to say that since we've both been live, the government's played a very big role in funding R&D, especially the R&D and sort of foundational knowledge. Has that always been the case? And if not, how was R&D funded prior to heavy government involvement?
No, it wasn't always the way that way. Things really changed in the Second World War. Um, I think prior to the Second World War, like the government was just not a major funder of science. It was more philanthropy and so on, and industry and so forth. Um, what really changed is just in the Second World War, the utility of science for sort of national interests just became like abundantly clear. Like there was nuclear weapons, there were airplanes, uh, dropping bombs. There was like major advances in sort of uh, medical care of infantry and so on who were injured in the war, and it just sort of people realized that like a nation's scientific base is sort of just as important as sort of the other traditional functions of government in sort of securing national defense or other prosperity. And so there was just a sea change after World War II, where in the United States we set up all these, uh, or greatly expanded all these sort of national funding for science projects.
Okay. And I don't know how the universities conduct themselves during that era, but today there does seem to be this culture that I think people call publish or perish. Do you think on net that has a positive impact on the quality of science, or not so much?
Yeah, so I guess you could argue that when you're using public funds for research, you start to get these questions of accountability and sort of how do you make sure people aren't just running away with the money and not using it. And one way that you can motivate people is you can track their output, but science is uh, it's tricky. Like how important is your contribution? And something that's really easy to count is just how many publications did you have, how much did you publish in top journals, and so we've got this new system where like this is very important for sort of career advancement, is if you're publishing in the right places and so forth. And it provides strong incentives to do research. Maybe that is bad for some kinds of science that are more like they need a long gestation time. They need a lot of going on walks and thinking for like 20 years, and then you suddenly have this breakthrough. But what's been sort of most studied is sort of these dynamics that publisher bearish creates to sort of race and beat other people to the punch, because science has this priority system where people think that well, the traditional idea is that the most credit for a discovery goes to whoever makes it first. And there are a couple of like good rationales for that. One is like once somebody has made a discovery, it's out there. And so how would you verify if somebody else said that they independently discovered it? How would you know that they really independently discovered it versus they just sort of copied it, or even just subconsciously that clicked some things together for them, even though maybe they had been working on it and they could tell a story that they were working on it. A second argument is like priority is a good thing to have because the social value of an idea is knowing it, and once you know it, knowing it again doesn't add anything. That's not totally true because like we like replications and stuff and so forth. But that's like for certain kinds of knowledge where like you either know it or you don't. Once you know it, you know it. You've got the value, and if somebody else rediscovers it, you're kind of like, well, that's nice, but actually like this adds nothing to our stock of human knowledge. We already knew it. So anyway, there's some of the reasons that science awards more credit to whoever's first. But that means that you got to be first, and that coupled with like the pressure to put out as many publications as you have, those are both sort of things that lead you to want to like do your research quick and get a publication out the door as fast as possible. And so, if you're in an environment where the people who do that, they think that's a good idea, maybe they're just like cynical, whatever. But anyway, the people who follow the incentives, who do it, they kind of get the tenure, they get the awards, they train the next generation, and the people who are like, I'm not going to let my life be ruled by these incentives, I'm just going to do the best science possible. Well, maybe they sort of become marginalized, and so they're not training the next generation, and over time you kind of get this culture of just publish fast, uh, do quick research, and so on. And so there are some studies that try to look at how does this distort the quality of our science. And I think like my main takeaway from this literature is like, yeah, you can actually detect an effect where like these priority races and trying to get out there first does reduce the quality of the discoveries. But I think that the effect is like not that big. Like if you have really nice data, and there's some papers that have like just great data on like the time spent on individual research projects, and they know who's working on the same thing, and they can tell because they're studying this field of structural biology where they know which proteins you're working on trying to figure out the 3D structure of, and they can figure out, it's not ambiguous like if we're working on the same thing or not. Like in economics, it might be ambiguous like if my project is really the same as your project. Here it's a protein, it's the same protein or not, whatever. Anyway, so they have really good data, they can sort of see this effect, and it's like, if I remember correctly, if you're in a field where there's like a lot of people working on this trying to find the same protein as you, people tend to shave their research time down by a few months. Maybe it was like 2 months, but this is out of like a year and a half or 2 years or something of total research time. If you don't have very good data, if you just have like big data, lots of observations, but you only have kind of these crude measures of how much competition there is, like um, are you an early career researcher or are you a tenured researcher, or like are you in a country that has like a really aggressive like pay for performance kind of incentive scheme, or are you in a country that doesn't? In those kind of like bigger data sets, like if the effects are there, they're not strong enough to show through clearly in that kind of messier data. So like my conclusion is like the effect is real. Um, I'm not sure it's like first order biggest problem that we have.
Mhm. What about the difficulties that you'd face if you were trying to establish a new scientific field of research? Because it's not as if science is this stagnant body of knowledge. It's always expanding, and with that expansion, you're going to find different fields, different subfields. Um, but clearly, you're going to have scientists who are already working on other fields that might seem more promising. So,
Yeah.
what are the incentives, do you think, to try and rear people away from those already established fields that might look more promising over to these more adventurous, albeit risky, new areas of knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, I think that um, like it seems desirable to have people exploring like a wider set of different topics because you know rather than having like intense competition within a particular area, since we just said like maybe it slows things down, um, maybe just have like more different topics uh, be under investigation at the same time. But like kind of what you I think alluded to is like there are these specific challenges to venturing forth and pioneering a new field, and that comes from kind of what I said earlier about like when we were talking about um, the kind of like the nature of the people doing the inventing and what they choose to work on. The advancing in science requires sort of convincing a community of your peers that your work is good, and so if you move off away from a field that has a community of peers and you go somewhere new that doesn't, who do you convince, right? There's this sort of critical mass problem of like chicken and egg of like how do you get the field going, because like if you're on your own, you need enough people there who are able to judge the quality of your work and the quality of the discoveries and sort of service peer reviewers and so on. And if you try to rely on people who are far away from your area. So, I'm pioneering this new area. There's nobody else doing it. So my peer review scores, stuff gets sent out to people in the nearest field. Well, we have some evidence like that, that people who are, if your peer reviewer is somebody who's far from your area of expertise, like from what you're working on, then like they're not going to look as favorably on your stuff. And I think that that's like pretty natural. Like it's just harder to be like a firm, zealous advocate for a area of research if you don't feel like as well. Like if it's your own area and you're like, this is a brilliant idea. These are brilliant scientists. These guys are 10 out of 10. Go for it. Whereas if it's somebody you don't know as well because they're in a different field and you don't know the subject is area, it sounds promising, but there's a lot of unknowns, and so I give it an 8 out of 10 or something. So anyway, in a really competitive environment, it might be hard to get funding. So there's this critical mass problem. The second thing is like it's just like when you go to a new field, you sort of start over, and that's in expectation, it's probably worse for you individually. Like you're probably not going to be just because like if you're starting over, like previously you were in an area that like people were working on, so like it had promise, like kind of like it wouldn't no, but people wouldn't be working on it if it didn't have promise. Now you're on something new, and like it's better if we have more people doing that. But for any individual, like it's just maybe a gamble, and like most gambles don't pay off. The ones that do are really good for society as a whole, and so we want to encourage people to take them. But for any individual, they're kind of maybe left holding the bag. Um, and then yeah, kind of a related factor is just like we do have evidence that when people like switch fields switch to a new field, so there's still people there, but so it's not like a totally new field, but it's not the field they were from. Well, people struggle to basically uh, have the same level of impact that they did in their original field. Like they're less likely to put out a publication that, for example, goes on to be one of the most highly cited publications of the year in that field. Um, and I think that could just be because it's like there's this burden of knowledge problem. You have to know so much to push the frontier, and anyone who's new to a field is going to struggle to do that. Maybe.
And I guess something that I have wondered about in the past is why is it the case that you have, say, various inventions being patented, but you don't really get the same thing happening with, say, scientific research? And I know you mentioned before how, once someone comes up with a theory or, they talk about a particular experiment they've done, that knowledge is out there. But would you say the reason why there's no patent or copyright granted because of the impracticality of applying it to scientific theories?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like the on the ground reason today why you can't patent it, and just like in the like you can't patent abstract ideas, just like the law says you can't. So like that's sort of like the easy answer. Like why don't we patent scientific discoveries? You can't. It's not legal. But why is it not legal? Is sort of maybe the more interesting question. Like
Mm.
why don't we change the law if we think this would provide a strong incentive? And I think the idea is that there are sort of two. There's patents are a way to they wrestle between two tensions. They provide strong incentives to invest in technologies by giving you sort of a temporary ownership over the idea, and you can exclude other people from using it, and so you can charge higher prices, monopolies, license it to other people, whatever. So it provides a good incentive, but at the same time, it blocks other people from using the invention, whether that's consumers who want to just like literally use the idea or other inventors who want to build on your idea and improve it. And so there's this tension, like, do they speed up or slow down progress? And they're going to most speed up progress in areas where these um, blocking effects are weak and these incentive effects are strong. Okay, so like the incentive effect can be strong if basically you know that this product, if you put enough effort into it, it would be desirable. A lot of people would want it, and so like uh, you know, if you can get the patent on it, you know that it'll be valuable and it's worth spending a lot of resources on. And the sort of spillover effects are moderate or like not as high for specific technologies because like one, they're like very developed and maybe kind of niche, and second, like people do have other ways to protect these ideas anyway. Like they could just keep them secret and sell the product and hope that people can't reverse engineer it. So maybe like the extra loss from the patent isn't that bad. Um, but ideas don't really fit. Like fundamental scientific research doesn't, I think, fit well into that schema. Like it's hard to know what you're going to discover. Like a lot of science is just sort of this open-ended curiosity. We're trying to figure out how something works. We don't really know if it'll be valuable, and we don't even really know what we're going to discover, right? Like we just sort of are trying to figure stuff out. And if we tried to spend a lot of time thinking about how valuable it was going to be, like down the road as a technology or so forth, it would be, I think it would be extremely difficult. Like as a rule of thumb, it takes like decades between when a scientific discovery is made and when it gets sort of finally out in the market as some kind of new product. So you've got a really long time lag, and there's just like lots of uncertainty. And then the other side is like these spillover effects of like letting other people build on the idea are really strong for sort of basic fundamental ideas about how the world works. Because like if you're talking about how the world works, that's like a new map that people can use to go do all sorts of different things on. And so it seems like a bad idea to basically block people from using that map and not let everyone who wants to use it try to use it. And the incentive effect we would get from like paying people for discovering certain discoveries is probably not that strong anyway, because it's too hard for people to predict, will this path of research lead to this particularly valuable discovery. That's my take on it. But yeah.
So, if you had to give just two, if you like, major incentives to encourage innovation, what would they be? Quite a broad question, I know,
Two
but
incentive. Yeah.
yeah, two sort of
Like
major ones you
new
can think
like
of.
new incentives, or like from the existing pool of ones that are
Oh,
sort of already
sorry, I
out
should
there.
have said yeah, new incentives.
Okay. Um, Let me think about that for a minute. All right. So if I was going to give two incentives to add to sort of our existing toolkit, I think one thing is like on the technology side, it'd be great to experiment more with technology prizes for certain kinds of things. Uh, we had a lot of, um, I think we had a lot of luck with like Operation Warp Speed in terms of like pushing the vaccine timetables out quickly, and part of that was through sort of prize like mechanisms. Like a prize is like if you do this, you get a prize. In this case, it was like, we're going to order a bunch of doses of your vaccine well in advance of you actually developing the vaccine, so that if you do, there's a huge profit incentive waiting for you at the end. Prizes are nice because they don't have this blocking side of patents, right? Like you get the money for doing the thing, but everyone else is still kind of free to use the technology. Uh,
Hmm.
Prizes only, I think, work though when you have uh, clear incentives about like if I know what I want and I know how to like I know that there's a path to go get there. Like if you don't really know what you want, like you don't know what you're getting. Like with basic science, I don't think prizes necessarily work so well. The other thing that I think would be interesting, it's kind of a different kind of prize, and I don't claim that this would like revolutionize science or anything, but I think I don't know, it's just my favorite idea. Is we have like people who are selecting what science gets funded are kind of these peer reviewers, and what are the incentives that they have to take risks and like fund risky science that maybe is likely to fail, but if it succeeded, they think it would be really transformative for their field. And right now, I don't think anyone is like super strong. Like maybe a guy who runs a grant program would get some sort of professional advance within their organization if they demonstrated really good judgment on science. But otherwise, like, what's the incentive for these people to do well? And so I think like experimenting with incentives among the people who make grants is kind of interesting. Um, Particularly like imagine a system where you have peer reviewers and you've got a system set up where like they can advocate for different research projects. Um, I think it'd be kind of interesting if we had a system where like you could identify like this guy was a real champion for this project. Uh, we could identify who were champions. We could see which ideas went on to become like really valuable, and then like we would offer like a reward to the peer reviewer who like championed that idea. A couple years after the fact, and since they're probably a researcher themselves, like if they're serving as a peer reviewer, they're probably an active scientist. Active scientists, what do they want? They want like money to do their own research. I think that we should have like a grant program where like we give research grants to fantastic peer reviewers who like picked the best science, because it's kind of like, well, you clearly have good taste about science, so we're going to give you a grant and we're going to give you like no paperwork, and you can just do with it what you want. So I don't know. Those are my kind of two ideas. They're both, I guess, prizes, but like one for technology and one for like the peer reviewers who develop, or I don't know, who demonstrate excellent taste. Sort of an award for best peer reviewing and best like selection of science is that you get to go do your own science without having to like go through as much bureaucracy.
Okay, a lot of food for thought. We're almost out of time, but just before we go, do you want to give your details as to how people can best keep up to date with what you're doing?
Sure. So as I said at the beginning, um, I write a living literature review about the academic research about innovation. It's an ongoing project that I spend, it's like part time, one of my duties at Open Phil. And you can follow that in two ways. Probably the easiest is there's a Substack called I think it's actually called What's New Under the Sun. And uh, there's a website that'll take you to the Substack too called newthingsunderthesun.com. The website is like this living literature review where there's tons of articles about different things, different little claims about science and innovation. We've talked about some of them here. And it's living in the sense that when the academic literature evolves or changes, I update the underlying articles. And then if you sign up for the Substack, you're basically alerted to anytime there's a change in the website. Like, here's a new article that's been put up, uh, or here are some changes we made this month to existing articles because there was new literature that came out. So that's my main piece of advice. Otherwise, I'm on Twitter, Clancy, uh, and yeah,
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been great to have you as a guest to launch it.
yeah, my honor. Like I said, thank you so much for having me. And good luck with the rest of it.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
All right, take care.